Hello everyone and welcome to PIT University 2020 and this particular discussion on cortisol. I'm Coach Aaron and you might have listened to my discussion on cortisol last year. If you did, don't worry. While there's a lot of the same content, because it's important, there is a lot of new information that is going to be critical that I hope that you can take with you today. Cortisol, in my opinion, might be one of the most overlooked or maybe unappreciated aspects of fitness and wellness. Maybe you are doing everything in your power as far as exercise and keeping tabs on your nutrition, but you're still not quite where you want to be. Cortisol might be that missing link that's going to help you get to your goals. So in this discussion, we're going to talk about the good, why cortisol is good for you, why your body needs it, the bad, how it could have a negative effect on your body, and how it could be impacting your training and wellness goals overall. So first, we'll kind of explain what cortisol is. Cortisol is a steroid hormone in the glucocorticoid class of hormones. When it's used as medication, it is most commonly referred to as hydrocortisone. It is often called the stress hormone because of its connection to stress response. It helps your body respond to stress and interrupts inflammation. So what it's going to do when it's secreted, it's going to move into cells and suppress the proteins that promote inflammation in your body. So not only is it the stress hormone, it could also be referred to as the anti-inflammation hormone. So what does it do? This is a brief list, and you might have heard of more things that cortisol actually does, but we'll just run through a few here to get started. Cortisol helps control your blood sugar. It's going to a degree, regulate metabolism. It's going to help reduce inflammation, like we just mentioned. It has a controlling effect on the salt-water balance in your body. We're not going to go as deep into that as just the overall stress response. And in women, it's going to support the developing fetus during pregnancy. So when we talk about cortisol, we have to talk about fight or flight. When we release cortisol, it is usually in response to any perceived stress. That is very important to remember, and something that I really hope you guys take with you today, because our bodies don't know the difference between actual stress and perceived stress. So if we're thinking negative thoughts, if we're worrying about an event coming up, our body's going to react as though that stress event is actually happening. Cortisol also turns off pain recognition so that even if we do get injured in an event, we can still fight to survive. So if you want to think about it this way, maybe, and this might be an extreme case, but you are in the forest, just maybe going for a walk, and a bear jumps out in front of you. You want to get away from that bear as quickly as possible. So we're going to take off, start running through the trees. You trip over a stick or a rock. When you do, you fall to the ground. Maybe you twisted your knee, you tweaked your ankle. Cortisol is going to turn off pain recognition so that we're able to jump up, continue running, and get away from that bear, and really kind of survive that stress event. When I was thinking about how our body doesn't know the difference necessarily between a perceived stress and an actual stress event, I remember this quote by Winston Churchill when he said, "When I look back on all these worries, I remember the story of the old man who said on his deathbed that he had had a lot of trouble in his life, most of which had never happened." So I just thought that was an interesting quote to throw in there when we're talking about perceived stress versus actual stress events. So our bodies are hardwired to have high levels of cortisol in the morning and low cortisol levels in the evening. So just like the sun rises, when the sun rises in the morning, our cortisol levels are going to be high. As we go throughout the day and the sun's going to set in the evening, our cortisol levels are going to decline. This was especially important in primitive times when we had to wake up with the sun, of course, and go out and hunt for our food and protect our families. So in the morning when we woke up, our cortisol levels were high so that our bodies could deal with that stress of going out and hunting for food, making sure that we had enough food for our families, Maybe if we came into contact with that bear that I was talking about, cortisol is going to help us deal with that stress of fighting off any enemies there. Now, after we found food and shelter for the day, we weren't as stressed. We could go back home, take our food to our families, and kind of start to wind down. That's when our cortisol levels declined so that we could go to sleep and recover. It's important to note that low cortisol and rest allows anabolic hormones like testosterone, growth hormone, and melatonin to be released to help us recharge and get ready for the next day. So we see here elevated cortisol will actually blunt the response of anabolic hormones. So really crucial to, as we go throughout the day, do the best we can to let our cortisol levels decline so that we can activate those growth hormones and testosterone and the melatonin so we can get as much rest as possible at night so our bodies can really recover and get us ready and recharged for the next day. So as far as cortisol secretion, it's going to travel to our liver to make new blood sugar. And that's important because we need blood sugar as fuel to survive whatever stress event we might be going through. Another quick note here that every time cortisol is secreted, norepinephrine is also secreted. They're kind of looked at as kind of partners in crime. So they're both going to be released when we're going through a stress event. That's important because norepinephrine increases blood pressure, it increases your heart rate, and also your blood sugar levels. Now, something that we'll talk about a little bit later, we could possibly get to the point where our cortisol stores are depleted. That's important because when we're in a stress event, we're still going to release that norepinephrine, which again is going to increase our blood pressure, increase our heart rate, and increase our blood sugar levels, but we're not going to have that cortisol to help fight that inflammation. So again, how does it work? When the body is stressed, again through inflammation, maybe that's illness or injury, when we are stressed, when we are fatigued, we have low blood sugar, that cortisol is going to be released to assist the body in recovering from that stress. Now, when cortisol levels are elevated, gluconeogenesis occurs, and that is the formation of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source. When that happens, amino acids and proteins are broken down and converted to energy and stored in the muscles. So, can we have too much of a good thing? Excess glycogen stored means potential weight or fat gain. Like I said, it's going to increase our blood sugar levels. And again, when our cortisol levels are high, chronically, I should say, that's going to lead to catabolic effects. It's like we just mentioned, cortisol levels are high, proteins are going to be broken down to form carbohydrates for energy production. This is going to inhibit protein synthesis. So we're not going to be able to use those proteins to build strong muscles. Again, when cortisol levels are elevated chronically, again, that's going to blunt the response of anabolic hormones, making it difficult to recover and build muscle. You might have heard from your coach or trainer that muscle isn't actually built when you're lifting the weights. Muscle is built when you are recovering or when you are at rest. So we could be going through a workout and working really hard, but if our cortisol levels don't decline when we're at rest, that's going to prevent those anabolic hormones from kicking in to help us recover and repair following either our stress event or following our workout. This kind of goes into cortisol's overall impact on training. Again, cortisol is going to increase with resistance exercise, mostly when rest periods are short or when total volume of work is high. So the more the body is stressed, the greater the need for cortisol release. If adaptation occurs, then cortisol won't necessarily be increased. You can think of this as if you're not increasing your weight in successive sessions, weight training sessions, your body's going to adapt to that workload. So cortisol isn't really going to be released because it doesn't need to. You don't have that extra stress on your body for cortisol to help fight off. Chronic high levels of cortisol, again, will have an adverse effect, limiting the influence of testosterone and muscle building. So again, we want our cortisol levels to decline following exercise so that we are preparing our bodies to rest and recover at night so that, again, we can build that muscle so we can get recharged for the next day. Just have this quote right here. Resistance training protocols that use high volume, large muscle groups, and short rest periods result in an increased serum cortisol values. Though chronic high concentrations of cortisol may have catabolic effects, acute increases still contribute to the remodeling of muscle tissue and maintenance of blood glucose. So really all that is saying is that when we are working our muscles in quick bursts, when we have that acute cortisol response to our body, that's when cortisol is going to be a good thing. But again, if we never let that cortisol come back down, that's when that's going to have a catabolic effect and really be detrimental to our health. But most immediately, it's going to be detrimental to our workouts. So have we ruined a good thing by keeping our cortisol levels chronically high? So cortisol was designed to be acute, but over time, and this is maybe because of technology, just how our lives have changed over time from those primitive days, we have made it chronic. Again, cortisol levels are high in the morning when the sun is out and decline as the day goes on and it begins to get dark. So just like electronics late at night can disrupt our circadian rhythms, it can also disrupt our cortisol timing. Extended time viewing our phones, our TVs, computers at night causes cortisol to be released. So you might have heard that if you aren't able to get to sleep at night, it's really okay just to get up, maybe do something productive. You can read, maybe try to get your body tired again so that you can go back to sleep. But it's important that when we get up and do that, we don't look at our phones, we don't look at TV or watch TV, we aren't on our computers because that lighting will cause our cortisol to be released, and it's almost like we're kind of starting over. Again, our cortisol levels are going to increase, and our ability to produce testosterone and growth hormone and melatonin, which you probably know is crucial for sleep, for the sake of repair and recovery at rest. I mean, that's going to be inhibited. So again, try to stay away from our phones and TVs and computers late at night. So if this happens, if our cortisol levels stay high at night, we aren't able to use those hormones that are going to help us repair and recover, we're not going to get enough sleep, and we're going to start the next morning with low cortisol. You might think that's a good thing in terms of not having chronically high cortisol, but we're going to feel sluggish. And what happens when we feel sluggish and tired? We're going to reach for caffeine. Caffeine, as you might remember, is also going to elevate cortisol levels. That's not necessarily a good thing, even though we're talking about being tired in the morning when our cortisol is the highest when we wake up. What we're really doing is chipping away at our cortisol reserves, and we're going to put ourselves at risk of certain diseases like cancer, like heart disease, like autoimmune disease. So essentially, our bodies are eventually going to run out of cortisol, which again helps us deal with stress and inflammation to fight off disease. So if we're not getting enough rest, if we're not letting our anabolic hormones do their job, we're going to chip away at those cortisol reserves. And eventually, if we come into a situation where we're going to end up with heart disease or some type of cancer or autoimmune disease, we're not going to have that cortisol to fight off the disease and infection. So again, I mean, caffeine and cortisol, I mean, we can probably talk about this for quite a while. Caffeine's probably the most popular, most used stimulant that we have. And again, I'm going to look to this 2006 study on cortisol response to mental stress, exercise, and meals following caffeine intake in men and women. So just to run through it really quick. Caffeine, again, elevates cortisol secretion, and caffeine is often consumed in conjunction with exercise and mental stress. Cortisol levels were measured in this particular study 8 times throughout the day on days when healthy men and women consumed caffeine and also underwent either mental stress or dynamic exercise, followed by a midday meal in a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover design. That part might not be that important to you, but just to kind of explain the type of study that was conducted. So the cortisol response to mental stress was actually smaller in women than in men. Go ahead, women, you can make your jokes about how women respond to stress better than men, but in this case, sorry guys, absolutely true. This study kind of confirmed that women were able to deal with mental stress a lot better than men. So in terms of the caffeine acted in concert with the mental stress to further increase cortisol levels, similarly in men and women. Caffeine can be taken before exercise, and that is going to elevate cortisol the same in both men and women. So if we're going to kind of simplify cortisol and everything that we've talked about, it's typically at its peak early in the morning. We like to say 6 a.m., but that kind of depends on your sleep schedule. And again, it's going to decline gradually throughout the day. Again, caffeine increases cortisol levels, especially during times of high stress. It's important to note that caffeine has a half-life of 5 to 6 hours. So if we're looking at bringing our cortisol levels down, whether that's and you're taking caffeine either right after your workout or kind of that midday or even late afternoon kind of caffeine boost, keep in mind that caffeine half-life is 5 to 6 hours. So say you are drinking caffeine at 6 o'clock, 6 p.m., just to give yourself a little extra boost, you have a little more work to do. That caffeine is going to impact your body likely until 11 p.m. or midnight. So again, take that into account. Like we talked about, we want our cortisol levels to come down at night so that we can get proper rest, so that we can use those anabolic hormones to help our body repair and kind of recharge for the next day. Again, important to note, acute cortisol is great for your body in dealing with stress like exercise and those fight or flight moments. But again, I feel like I'm repeating it. We don't want to keep our cortisol levels chronically high. So that acute cortisol secretion is great for your body, and that's why it's there to help deal with stress. But again, whether it's meditation or just like sitting down to help your body and your mind unwind, we really want to try to drop those cortisol levels as the day goes on. So when are cortisol levels highest? Again, in the morning when we wake up, they're going to be elevated during times of stress, during illness or injury, again, so your body can fight off that inflammation or that infection. They're going to be high if you have low blood sugar. Again, your body is going to increase blood sugar levels with that cortisol secretion. And again, cortisol levels are going to be high with excessive caffeine intake. So effects of low cortisol, just a few mentioned here, and you can kind of take from some of the other things that we talked about, but effects of low cortisol are going to be fatigue. You might have mood swings if your cortisol is too low, and actually changes in skin. If your cortisol level is too low, you are risking being easily bruised. So that's something to take into account, something to think about there. So kind of recommendations for controlling your cortisol levels and kind of keeping them in check. You want to avoid overtraining and fatigue. Again, when you overtrain, that's going to actually contribute to that catabolic effect of your muscle. You're going to be fatigued. Your body's going to feel like it has extra stress on it. So that's when cortisol might be secreted just to help deal with that stress. You need to consume enough calories from non-processed foods to prevent depletion. And we talked about sleep. Make sure that you're getting between 7 and 9 hours of sleep per night. I know some of you might be laughing right now, saying there's no way that I can get that much rest. But it's really important if we're looking at the effect cortisol can have on your body, that you get enough sleep every night. That'll decrease stress and, like we discussed, allow anabolic hormones to do their job, aiding in that muscle repair and recovery, and also so that you don't let your cortisol reserves go into depletion. Again, consume enough carbohydrates and protein after training. That's going to let those cortisol levels come down. It's going to, by doing that, you're going to control your blood sugar. You're going to prevent further muscle breakdown, and you're going to ensure proper recovery to keep cortisol from remaining chronically high. You should avoid excessive amounts of intense aerobic endurance training, again, unless training for an endurance event. The reason for that, aerobic endurance training is linked with protein loss from muscles, inducing a higher cortisol response. So not knocking on aerobic endurance training. Again, if that's your sport or if you're training for a certain race or event, by all means go ahead and do that. But just keep that in mind, that that will have an effect on your cortisol response. So I'll leave you with this quote from George Burns. He said, "If you ask what is the single most important key to longevity, I would have to say it is avoiding worry, stress, and tension. And if you didn't ask me, I'd still have to say it." He might have been on to something more than he realized. I'm sure that probably wasn't his original intent in the message. But when we look at longevity, when we look at staying healthy, in terms of cortisol, it really is important to control our stress, control the stress in our lives, make sure that we're in turn controlling our cortisol levels. And if we can do that, we really will be on our way to much healthier lives. So I hope this discussion helped. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. Send a direct message to the PIT Facebook page or even Instagram if you want to, and we'll do our very best to get back with you and answer those questions. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion and have a good rest of your day.